Obhijit.
Hello and welcome. This is Ovijit. I welcome you all um, on behalf of School of Media Communication Culture, Jalpu University, um to this seminar or colloquium or a panel discussion. In fact, we are meeting after somewhat a long break because for some months we have not been able to organize the lectures that we usually organize uh, on behalf of School of Media Communication and Culture. This has been a regular affair before, but due to pandemic and for some reasons, we couldn't do that. In fact, during the pandemic as well, we had some, but we couldn't regularize this. But we plan to regularize this now. And in this, uh, mm, you know, mm, new phase. We all welcome you all, and please watch this space. We are going to have a series of lectures. This, in fact, is the first of uh, this new series of lectures that we have planned. I'm sure that many of you know about School of Media Communication Culture. This is a school that was established in the late 1980s. Um, we work in the field of media and cultural studies, communication studies. We have a PhD program. We have a certificate course on radio production. We have a number of projects. Right now, of course, not all the projects are running because of funds crunch, but we're looking for new projects. We're writing our proposals. Um, we had a long-standing relationship with UNICEF. We work with the government, some NGOs. We work with marginal communities. We do take special interest in the functioning of which we are part of the management of 90.8 Community Radio JU. So we have a number of activities. So without much ado, I uh, request my colleague, Dr. Shayantan Dashgupta, who is the Joint Director of the school, to introduce our speakers for this evening and introduce the program that we are going to have now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Obhijit, Professor Obhijit Rai, Director of the School of Media, Communication and Culture. Thank you for introducing the school and its activities and also for welcoming the delegates. We have a very exciting session today and something that has a great topical importance for today's world. The session today is titled Searching for the Possibility of a Kabuliwala, Cross-Cultural Conversations through Zahida Hina's Kumkum Theek Theek Hai. We have Debaroti Chakraborty and Avirupa Bhaduri, who will be doing this presentation, and Shourish Ghosh. We are very privileged to have Shourish Ghosh also to be participating as the discussant for this session. I will just read out the bio notes, basic details about our speakers today. Dr. Debaroti Chakraborty is Assistant Professor in the Department of Performing Arts, Presidency University. As a researcher artist and performance thinker, she focuses on making cross-cultural and intercultural performances based on lived experiences, narratives, and oral history. Her doctoral work broadly studies narratives of women in India and Latin America through a comparative perspective in the context of borders. She has been touring, researching, and making performances in collaboration with artists, researchers, and communities in India, in the United States of America, in the US-Canada border, and in the US-Mexico border as well. Dr. Chakraborty has been an instructor at the Bodies at the Borders collaborative video conferencing course between Cornell University and Jadavpur University. And as a guest lecturer, she also teaches Latin American literatures in the Department of Comparative Literature, Jadavpur University. She also writes as a performance critic with the Telegraph. We also have with us Avirupa Bhaduri, who is a teacher of media and communication at ISB&M, Kolkata, a postgraduate in management with HR specialization. She shifted to working for positive psychology intervention among underprivileged communities, being associated with the Center for Applied Positive Psychology, Coventry, UK, after having worked with leading national media organizations. She has over 20 years of experience in radio broadcast, being associated with All India Radio since 1998. She is one of the 10 women broadcasters selected by Spotify for their international Sound Up project. She has also worked for several organizations like TCS, ActionAid, as resource person, and as a communication and community leadership trainer. She has contributed to numerous theatre productions, both national and international, two of which have received patronage from the Ministry of Culture, Government of India. She is also presently a content producer of a YouTube channel, apart from being an artist herself and a parent. As discussant for today's session, we have Dr. Shourish Ghosh. Dr. Ghosh is an independent researcher. He has completed his PhD in 2019 from the Department of International Relations, Jadavpur University, and he has worked on Afghanistan. He has written extensively and delivered talks on Afghanistan, both in India and abroad. He has been the recipient of the UKRI Fellowship in 2014, where he worked on a project on trilateral peace initiatives in Afghanistan in collaboration with King's College London and Johns Hopkins University. He is presently engaged in editing a book on Afghanistan. So thank you to all three of you for being with us today, and we can begin now.
Thank you. Thank you, Obijinda. Thank you, Shantunda. Maybe we'll not delay it any further. We'll directly start with our presentation. Searching for the possibility of a Kabuliwala, cross-cultural conversations through Zahida Hina's Kumkum Theek Theek Hai, translated as Kumkum is doing fine. I have found through these years of my interaction with communities, collaborators from different cultures, as well as in intergenerational narratives, that the impact of an event in history shapes the inner self, the intimate self, the rational and the emotional being in unprecedented ways. We are part of a continuous process of mass displacement that probably started with the emergence of the modern nation, legitimized by straight-jacketed categories of disposability and non-disposability. I have inherited the consciousness of losing one's home through the multiple tellings and retellings of stories of struggles and endurance from my grandparents. These memories and emotional responses have informed my value system, ethics, and habits. Today, we are placed in a world where thousands of refugees flee to escape war and persecution. Innumerable groups of migrants have lost homes and are on an unending journey. Unimaginable number of people are routinely straddling borders, while ironically, the global economy makes tall claims of setting up a borderless world. Although I lived in the same city, the same neighborhood, the same house, almost in the same room for the first 24 years of my life, I descend from refugees who were exiled from home and language. I knew of the borders in the story of the man from the other faith who helped my grandfather cross over and was later killed. I saw how my grandmother nurtured life in the face of trauma through rituals of planting, making tea, cooking, stitching. So amidst my given world of rootedness, stability, security, familiarity, fixed morality, I have experienced a strange kind of restlessness, a kind of divided consciousness. Much later in life, I recognized through intercultural relationships, artistic, academic, and personal, that a new world of perspective opens up when the performative being from our daily lives is activated. I find profound knowledge in collectively exploring the mundane rituals of eating, of walking, of sleeping, of sharing stories. Much of my academic and artistic work leans on forging connections across divides through oral narratives of everydayness, inherited memory, and intergenerational narratives as I always crawl, stand suspended, or even rooted to an in-between space that I call the border. Zahida Hina's story or fictitious letter, Kum Kum Theek Theek Hai, written in 2011 and translated by Yusuf Shahid as Kum Kum is Doing Fine, has framed many of these artistic conversations that we will now talk about. Hina read the story as an Urdu sequel to Tagore's Kabuliwala at the 2011 conference of the Indian Association of Women's Studies in Wardha, India. When she introduced the story, she recounted that, and I quote, Kabuliwala found a place in her heart in early childhood when her grandmother used to read out Tagore's Kabuliwala to her. In Zahida Hina's narrative, Mini is now Kumkum's 75-year-old grandmother. It again crosses several borders, geopolitical as well as psychological, as Kumkum writes to Mini from Kabul. That was once a vibrant land of her tales. Kumkum has grown up hearing the fantastic tales of Kabul from her grandmother. She volunteers to take a posting in wartime Afghanistan and nurse the wounded there because she feels that the power of her grandmother's and great-grandfather's stories of the Kabuliwala Rehmat has pushed her to look for a connection. She almost performs an ethical duty, catalyzed by her personal history and intergenerational memory. But the plight, the deprivation of today's devastated Afghanistan shatters her fantasy and leaves her in deep pain as she writes to her grandmother. This piece evoked a deep-seated idea of waiting, one of hiraeth, which formed a founding moment for a few of us to come together and share our own bordered experiences through artistic and poetic pieces. Artist-scholar Rosalie Purvis and I co-wrote a poetics piece to which Marianne van der Gbe and Prarthana Hazra responded with their visual art to create a textured tapestry. I artistically processed a restlessness that I inherited from my grandmother's experience of a sudden loss when the river in her village in Kumilla, East Bengal, was turned into a border. Azmal Chacha used to come every Sunday from the neighboring village with his famous surma. My grandmother and her friends used to wait near the ghat because Azmal Chacha, as I heard the story, used to cross over and come to their village. But then one sudden Sunday, he didn't come. And then they waited for many more Sundays. Azmal Chacha could never cross the river, and they could never realize that the river has turned into a border. Rosalie spoke of how the Berlin Wall had separated her from her closest childhood friend when she was 8 years old, growing up in Amsterdam. She had always pictured a curtain made of iron. Marianne's works are vignettes that speak of her experience of the Holocaust after the genocide had destroyed her lineage. Zahida Hina's letter, on one hand, gave us an entry point to share these personal histories of being displaced, and on the other hand, situated our own experiences of trauma within a larger context of mass migration across cultures. We had titled this particular piece, No More a River. These artistic or poetic pieces resonate with Hina's story, Kum Kum Theek Theek Hai, as well as with Tagore's short story, Kabuliwala, in touching upon an illuminating moment of human empathy, when barriers set up by cultural politics, ethical positions, and codes of morality collapse. In Tagore's story Kabuliwala, Mini's father, the narrator, connects with the Afghan Rehmat from his position of being a father. Mini also reminds Rehmat of his own daughter Amina, left behind in Afghanistan. Tagore's story transcends othering through religious and cultural borders to foreground the power of human relationships. The humanizing impact of Tagore's story Kabuliwala has evidently inspired Hina to foreground the effective power of emotional bonding across linguistic, religious, and cultural divides. Kumkum, towards the end of the letter, writes about an encounter with a young Taliban boy in the middle of a night in the little bombed out hamlet of Dasht-e-Lela, and of her conflict between the impulse to report him or heal him. She provides him with first aid, gives him some money, and asks him to leave. Hina writes,
My first
and
thought
we quote,
was of calling a backup. Something unexpected happened. Flash, the boy's face transformed. He took something out of his sack, lying near his feet, and extended it towards me. I looked at his hand. It was full of almonds, raisins, and walnuts. He was calling you. Nervously, I looked at him. I swear by God that was Rahmat Baba in the light of January moon, and his shirt was stained with blood. Great-grandfather had written that every January he used to go back to his home beyond the Hindu Kush mountains. Tears came to my eyes. How could I get him arrested? He was your childhood, my great-grandfather's story. He took the same hand to his forehead and saluted me, threw his bag and blanket on his shoulder, and went out of the tent. I kept on staring at his receding form, a lone soul, enveloped in fog and moon dust. After a few steps, he stopped and turned and looked towards me. Those were the eyes of a defeated tribe.
Minnie's friendship with the Kabuliwala had not just erased the threatening stereotype of the Kabuliwala, but had actually become the basis for deep bonding, which catalyzed Kumkum's need to reach out to Kabuliwala's community in their times of struggle. Rabindranath had written the story Kabuliwala in 1892, when the figure of the Afghan peddler was equated with that of the outsider in the city of Calcutta. During that time, the men from Kabul used the international trade route to come to Calcutta to sell dry fruits, and they often stayed on to become money lenders. The foreignness of the Kabuliwala in Calcutta was contained in the stereotype of large, bearded men who carried huge sacks and kidnapped children. These stereotypes were often evoked to frighten children and to keep them away from these outsiders in the city. The figure of the Kabuliwala in Calcutta was already villainized before the last decade of the 20th century, when thousands of Afghan refugees fled to India to escape the war and persecution by the Taliban in Afghanistan. Tagore's story humanized the figure of the Afghan from Kabul and transformed the perception of Kabuliwala into that of an exiled man, a father who's longing to meet his daughter. While talking about her reception of Tagore's story, Zahida Hina had said, and I quote this from Nirupama Dutt's blog, "I know well what it is to be an outsider. I struggled to make my identity in the new land as circumstances had greatly changed for our family with the migration. After the Talibanization of Afghanistan and the US counterattack on Afghanistan following the 9/11 tragedy, Tagore's story came back to haunt her, and Kumkum Theek Theek Hai is a response to that experience. Zahida Hina was born in Bihar the year before the partition of 1947, and then moved from India to Pakistan as an infant when her father migrated to Karachi. In the rendition of her story, Zahida Hina's own experience as a religious and linguistic outsider resonated with Tagore's portrayal of contradiction and transcendence in the encounter with otherness. We experienced the humanizing power of a literary text when I read the fictitious letter from Kumkum to her grandmother Minnie across the political borders of India, Pakistan, and Afghanistan, across the linguistic barriers between Bangla and Urdu, and across more than a century, from Tagore to Hina.
And then there was a real life story from your own childhood, in this very lifetime, about Rahmat, the hawker from Kabul. When you first saw him, you were frightened and thought his bag was full of little children. Then you became friends. You would talk together, he would listen to you and fill your anchal with almonds, raisins, and walnuts. Once he told you he had a huge elephant in his small bag. You told me that the day Rahmat Baba was released after 8 years in prison was the day of your marriage. He borrowed dry fruits from another hawker and gave it to you as your wedding gift. When you told me the story for the first time, your eyes were full of tears. And then I knew that even adults can cry like children. You told me that Rahmat Baba also had a daughter of your age who lived in Kabul. He didn't have the money to get her photographed, or perhaps in those days there were no photographer in Kabul. So he had a print of her hand on a piece of paper and used to keep it in his pocket near his heart, just like Papa used to keep my photo in his wallet. Your father, I mean my great grandfather, had given some money to Rahmat Baba so that he could go back to Kabul and see his daughter, which made great grandmother very angry. Rahmat Baba never came back after that.
The power of the grandmother's stories have gifted Kumkum with a cultural wisdom that enables her to transcend these borders, religious and political. She can look beyond the demonization of Afghanistan as the land of the Talibans and identify the oppressive structures under which people are Talibanized in Afghanistan. Tagore's story had already challenged the jingoistic, politicized religious ideology that stereotyped the Muslim as the outsider or the invader. Zahida Hina now situates Kumkum's ethical position and scientific mindedness as a medical practitioner within the context of Tagore's ideology of universal humanism. She writes,
You have told me that you had made the daughter of Rahmat Baba an unseen friend of yours. In your imagination, you would marry your boy doll with her girl doll. But when great grandmother heard it from you, she was angry. How could a Hindu doll be married to a Muslim one? You were laughing when you narrated all that to me. My father's heart was very big. It could accommodate all, Ishwar, Allah, Hindus, and Muslims, you said fondly, remembering great grandfather. And when I performed the heart dissection for the first time in the medical college, at once I started looking for Allah, for Ishwar, Hindus, and Muslims, but they were only muscles, veins, and arteries. Nowadays, when I receive wounded, bleeding patients, shouting with pain or breathing their last, I sometimes ask myself, had you not eaten those almonds and pistachios from Rahmat Baba's bag 70 years ago? Had my great grandfather not written his story, would I still be here in Kabul, in Kandahar, in Herat, in Helmand? Perhaps not. Most definitely not.
Kumkum sees the war-torn Afghanistan through her own personalized prism, layered by her grandmother's memory of an unusual friendship with Rahmat Baba as a child, by her own connection with her grandmother through stories, habits, and morality that defied stereotypes, by the lingering shadow of the imprint of Rahmat's daughter's hands, as well as her own awareness of contemporary cultural politics and the mass destruction that she witnesses in war-ridden Afghanistan. Her position as a woman who had grown up in a quasi-liberal Bengali household in Calcutta leaves her severely affected by the suffering of women in Talibanized Kabul. This drills a deeper contradiction because she's also able to perceive how young boys in Kabul are made victims of politics of hatred towards women. They grow up in a land where women are systematically disrespected, violated, killed, or made invisible. Now we are going to show a small clip from the play that we had dramatized based on this letter, which is called Dear Earth, Hope You're Keeping Well, which would probably resonate with this part of Kumkum's experience, where she is actually articulating this contradiction. Avirupa, will you play the first clip, please?
Yes, I'm trying to do that.
Have you seen this city even once in your dreams? You would have never let me come here. There are shadows of death on the walls of each house and lines of blood in every street and bazaar. Rahmat Baba left ages ago. His children may have died too, or who knows, they got killed in the Soviet gunfire or in American bombing. Devastation stalks every corner of the city. Each place is in ruin. When I left home, you kissed my hands and told me, stitch all their wounds with these hands for Fatima. Here I am, all exhausted, stitching their wounds, but the wounded, they still keep on coming.
Why didn't you ask me how long I've been waiting? Set down on the road with the gunshots exploding. I'm waiting for you in the gloom and the blazing. I'm waiting for you.
Did I come across your childhood hero in the streets of Kabul? I did not even meet his children, his grandchildren. And how could I have met them when they all must have perished in the cellars of their houses? Nadima, I have stitched the hands of those girls who no more have palms, who would never do henna on their hands or knees, would never put bangles on their wrists. Nadima, do you remember my friend Razia? She used to run to you when he met Chabe Barak and say, Nadima, please make the same designs on my hands as you did on Kumkum's or last Holi. Here, there are thousands of girls whose palms would never see a Eid or a Shabe Barak.
Debaroti, please unmute yourself.
Sorry. Right after this, when Kumkum talks about her experience and her trauma as a medical practitioner in Kabul, and what she witnesses about women, right after this, she writes,
When I bandaged some Taliban boys and operated upon them, I stared at them for a long time. Those whose childhood has had no roof of a home, who had never been fed in a loving relative's lap, whose naughty teeth have never bitten those fingers which fed them rasgulla and laddu, who never received handfuls of raisins and almonds clandestinely from an elder, who have never heard fairy tales from the lips of a grandmother, and who had never got puris fried and malida made for them by a mother, what would they do when they grew up, if not strangle and kill others? How would they get sweetness in their hearts and compassion for other people's pain? The whole world vilifies Taliban. Even I, when I came here, had my heart full of hate and anger for them. But when I passed a few days here, I understood them. When the children of a poor and barren land are deprived of their childhood, when they had no elder sisters to take them through their first steps or play hide and seek with, then in such a land, you get the Taliban who hate women.
Zahida Hina's letter particularly speaks to the context of South Asian perspective of the day in the way that it launches a stark critique of Islamic fundamentalism as it does of US imperialism. Caught between these two opposing fundamentalists' political ideology, where nation states confront each other through extreme forms of violence, it is the power of human relationships, of the fond memory of a long-lost bonding, of human presence and frailties that become a humanizing force. A cultural or literary text such as this has the potential to evoke affective realities and mobilize an alternative history cutting through the dominant politics of fear and exclusion. In these times when fundamentalist political narratives dominate, we attempt to create multi-toned readings, interpretations, and representations of these literary texts to lead to a meaningful human engagement that can eventually forge a political and ideological stand that is probably more humane, rational, and radical.
Why we dramatized? Partly because in our quest to communicate as performers, we decided to explore through autoethnographical lens of Mini, Kumkum, our grandmothers, and beyond. Our attempt was to amplify the philosophical scope of an alternative worldview using the medium of theatre, focusing on organic storytelling, holistic connections, collaboration, and even intuition. We hoped that our presentation could bring forth a platform for sharing stories, experiences through immersive engagements that are otherwise lost in an academic question.
Then, on December 16th, 2014, the very day we had met for the first workshop, we received the shocking news. The Taliban had launched its deadliest attack ever, killing 132 Pakistani school children at the Army Public School in Peshawar. How could any vision of humanism and empathy sustain in the face of this wave of deep hatred? We asked ourselves, how could we even talk about the affective power of our play in the throes of this event, far less reach out with it to a larger audience? At one point in the letter, Kumkum wrote, "Perhaps I have taken after you and great-grandfather, that's why I dream with open eyes." At this stage, I had multiple conversations with my professor, Kavita Punjabi, who had introduced this text to me. She had said that the idea for reading and sharing these literary texts was to learn to dream with open eyes, to dare to envision other worlds with the feet planted firmly in reality, in full knowledge of the real politic destroying this world. However, as artists, we were struggling to pull ourselves out of this shock and find a rationale to stage our performance that also empathizes with the young Taliban boy who has been a victim of the fundamentalism. In our workshops that followed, we immersed ourselves in reading different texts from across cultures and historical time that resist violent statist discourses with a universal philosophy of humanism steeped in an idiom of love and solidarity.
Here, I would like to quote one such source, a very small one, a small instance from Deshe Bideshe. One particular incident is rather significant, especially in today's context, where Sayyid Mujtaba Ali's chance encounter with a rogue mercenary soldier of Bachai Sakau, the warlord who took siege of Kabul at that time, reveals a strangely humane face. After recognizing Mujtaba Ali as his teacher, he volunteers to help with ration and promises to safeguard his home. That little flicker of one-to-one connect, of bonds of respect and empathy, acts as a counterpoint to the dominant narrative of the gang's monolithic, monstrous image, akin to the present Taliban.
We embraced these cultural resources to touch upon the politics that lie at the core of this philosophy, and to find inspiration for ways to creatively express the affective power of these texts, which can catalyze human engagement and yet not communicate any sort of support for or validation towards the dominant political narratives. Tagore celebrated the higher moral power in the face of narrow fundamentalism. In 1916, he rang a prophetic alarm in his critique of a particular brand of nationalism that sought to follow the Western principle of governmentality that was hinged upon territorial power. He signaled the conflagration of violence in the ways the borders were manipulated by the structures of uneven economy while they obstructed human traffic. Tagore foregrounded the domain of Indian spiritual thought, human love and inclusion as an organic basis of unity in situations when different cultural resources and origins coagulate. Tagore had always dealt with the nuanced idea of waiting for the inside to meet the outside, for the inner self to embrace the other, the passage between the home and the world. His fictional works are connected by the same philosophy of universal humanism, in the depiction of how the inner worlds of Amol in Dagghor, Bimala in Ghore Baire, or Raja in Rokto Korobi strives to expand.
And parallel to Tagore's vision, we can posit his contemporary Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan, his anti-colonial non-violent resistance movement inspired by Gandhian philosophy. Khudai Khidmatgar was a direct antithesis of the trope of traditional violence-ridden Afghan society, marred by tribal turfers and deep-rooted patriarchy. Shimanto Gandhi, as he was fondly christened, dared to dream of a non-conformist, progressive Afghan identity that was distinctly different from the Western frame, thought to be impossible at that time.
In our dramatization, we had titled Dear Earth, hope you're keeping well. We used window frames as a theatrical tool which evolves as a metaphor that indicates how each character is confined within borders, geopolitical, social, internal, and yet they are trying to reach out to the outer world, be it the world of Kabuliwala, the world of Minnie's childhood, or Kumkum in her own inherited world of idealism. This theatrical language also speaks of how each character relates with the world through her own prism, shaped by lived experiences, memory, and imagination. In this theatrical piece, little Minnie, older Minnie or Dadima, and Kumkum converse across all these barriers in space and time. Zahida Hina's letter began to evoke a polyphony of voices and literary texts. We did draw upon Worcestershire, upon many other literary and cultural sources, all of which have consolidated into a deep philosophical insight and a moment of inspiration for the multiple renditions. Since 2014, when we started to work on this particular fictitious letter, political and cultural context shifted. New waves of political violence, dispossession, and religious bigotry afflicted masses of people, and we have each time returned to this multi-toned narration with a deep-seated dilemma about our position as witnesses to or victims of abrasive political apparatus, and as conscientious artists attempting to talk about universal humanism in staging these violent realities. Very lately, in last year, in 2020, 6 years since we had started working on this letter, we hopelessly had to add a few more lines to the performance script with the hope that no more. These are the few lines that we added in the script.
Mercy? A 19-year-old girl, a 19-year-old Dalit girl. A 19-year-old Dalit girl from a distant village is gang raped. She dies. Her body is burnt in the break of dawn. Her family pleads to see her for the last time. They're shot aside. She burns.
We rub our faces, brew our coffee, spew our anger through our windows.
A 12-year-old boy, a 12-year-old hungry boy. A 12-year-old hungry boy laid off from a spice grinding factory in the city. He hangs from the back of a truck. He wants to never be poor. Holds on to the rim of the truck. Starved in the pandemic. He wants to go home. He never wants to be poor.
We scratch our tails, clean our nails, spew our anger through our windows.
Bills are passed.
A farmer burns.
Bills are passed.
A faith is burnt.
Bills are passed. Freedom burns.
We stick our tongue into the pyre of the sovereign, secular, socialist,
democratic republic.
Manto's powerful dedication in his prolific work Siya Hashe, A Black Margin, where he says, and he dedicates it to the man who, when recounting his many bloody deeds, said, "When I killed that old woman, I suddenly felt as if I had committed a murder." Manto recounts one of the most horrific human tragedies with a moment of faith in humanity. We believe that it is this epiphanic moment, nourished by a deeper philosophy and cultural wisdom as is embedded in these literary texts, that has the potential to mobilize an alternative history. This last clip that we are going to show is from the play Dear Earth, Hope You're Keeping Well, that we staged in 2017. That is the last when we had staged this play. And we will end with this clip.
thinking? Talk about mercy? Mercy. Today the rock of USA is all over. From Kandahar to Kunduz, from Ghosh to Kalai Jungle. Earlier, armies destroyed population and left. But today's armies do not leave. They drop biscuits, butter packets, and bombs. And yet, we haven't learned from history. World War I, World War II are but faded memories now. The photo of I have quickly keeps me awake at night. I think of you, Kumkum, in your red and blue pinafore jumping for joy on the beach. Human civilization should be for mercy to this child. You have a home to return to. But think of all those who are displaced by civil war, by genocide, by persecution, and they are forced to flee, leaving behind their homes in Kabul, in Syria, in Yemen, Jaffna, and the queue of refugees keep getting longer as the borders get blurred.
No one leaves home unless home becomes the mouth of a shark. You only run for the border when you see the whole city running as well. No one leaves home unless home chases you. Fire under feet, hot blood in your belly. There's no something here of someone saying. Until the day burns and sitting in it. And even then, you carry the anthem under your breath, sobbing as each mouthful of paper made it clear that you would not be going back. Another day has slowly, time is slowly ticking. The virus causes silence, moving on missing. Now you see, it's not me, it's not my family. In your head, they're all fighting. You have to understand that no one leaves their children in a boat unless you want them to safer than the land. No one burns their farms on the trains, in carriages. No one spends their days and nights in the stomach of a truck feeding on newspaper. Unless the mind travel means something more than a journey. No one calls on offenses. No one wants to be beaten. Pitied. Another mother's breaking, heart is taken over. The violence causes silence. We must be missing. It's the same old thing since 1960. In your head, there are violence with their talents and their loves and their bombs and their guns. In your head, there are dying. I want to go home, but home is the mouth of the shark. Home is the barrel of the gun, and no one would leave home unless home chased you to the shore. Unless home told you to quicken your legs, leave your clothes behind, cross through the desert, wade through the oceans, drown, save, be hungry, beg, forget pride. Your survival is more important. In your head, someday, what's in your head? In your head, someday, what's in your head? No one leaves home becomes a sweaty voice in your ear saying, "Leave, run away from me. I do not know what I have become. But I know that anyway,
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Debaroti and Avirupa, for that very rich and sensitive presentation, bringing together literature and the other arts. And it's a presentation that was at the same time critical as well as creative, intertwining, I think, the image as well as the note, the textual element as well as the performative element, the world of light and the world of shadows that was so evident in the presentations, the recordings that you showed. Also bringing together sound and silence and the possibilities of both. And all of this without moving away from the main focus, which is such a poignant and such an important and such a relevant thing for us to engage with in this particular context. And there is something very specific about this context, but also something very general about this predicament, perhaps. So I will now request Dr. Shourish Ghosh to respond to this presentation and to take the conversation forward from here. Shourish.
Thank you, Shantunda. It was I'm just lost with words sometimes. It was an excellent presentation, Debaroti and Chakraborty and Obu. And as Afghanistan is very close to my heart, I was completely floored when I was reading this fictitious letter of Hina, and it took me to some other level. As you have rightly mentioned about the pain of the refugees for those imaginary lines which we call borders, I come from a family of refugees as well. And I used to hear hundreds of stories from my grandmother about our land in Manikganj, Dhaka. And I can very well relate to it, to what Hina has written, and especially on Afghanistan. But I would like to share some experiences which I felt while seeing this presentation and also reading the letter. The first experience which I would like to share is quite haunting for me, and I'm still trying to recuperate with it. As Afghanistan has come back to this limelight once again after some time, because Taliban has taken control once again in Kabul. So the day when Taliban entered Kabul, I got a WhatsApp call from one of my friends in Kabul. And he is a top-notch official of the Ghani administration. He was there, and he has he's a little daughter of who's she's just 2 years old. And I asked him what's happening, and he was completely frightened, and he told me that I don't know. I went for a visa to the Indian embassy so that at least my family can live. But they denied the visa by saying they are not providing visas now. And Taliban has entered Kabul, and we don't know what to do, what will happen, because they might not spare us, because we have been working with the government for such a long time, which is completely anti-Taliban. And I can sense that fear on his voice when he told me that, please pray for me, Shourish, pray for me. I told him that why don't you try some other country? Why don't you try Turkey or some other country going there, Albania, which will allow refugees? So he said that due to COVID and this situation, no embassy is working properly. And as the Taliban has entered, and there is complete pandemonium, so to take the call whether they can leave or not. And searching has begun, a door-to-door searching has begun, that who were working where and what they have done. Though this is not very evitable, which is coming into the media, but we know that after that day, what happened, you have seen over the TV, the people, thousands and thousands of people in Kabul airport trying to flee Afghanistan. and many of them died. And since that day, I've not been able to reach him. His phone is not. I'm not getting his phone, which I don't know whether he's been able to flee Kabul on that day or not, or he's still there. I really don't know. So it's quite haunting. As I was reading this, I had so many memories while working on Afghanistan and traveling and talking to refugees, Afghan refugees in America, in England, in India, and Pakistan, and everywhere. So this is where I can feel complete oneness with that letter, with what you have said. But coming to the Taliban issue, that where Hina says that the vilification of Taliban, the Taliban has been demonized majorly. There is some experiences as well, and these experiences, I got the opportunity of meeting Taliban leaders, exiled Taliban leaders in abroad, and I was when I was meeting them, I felt that I don't know what will happen. A researcher from India is trying to meet them, and we have always seen them as antagonistic towards our interest all the time. But when they came, and when I faced them, they were polite, they were speaking in English, and the first part which I saw, that he came in front of me, and I stood up from my sofa, and he said that, Assalamu alaikum, brother. The brother, as you know, is a Farsi word which means brother, and he hugged me, the leader, and I never knew what to do, and whether the notion which I have about Taliban, or what we are seeing now, or what I have seen is something. Am I audible now, Shantanda?
Yes, much better. Thank you.
Okay. As very complex, it's much more complicated. As Hina pointed out to the Taliban boy, which mentions with such precision and impunity, reminds me about a book which was written on the poetries of Taliban. These are the Taliban people who have been caught by the Americans and sent to Guantanamo Bay or Abu Ghraib prison, and they have been there before they are either released or killed. So I would like to narrate one of the few lines from one of the poetry which has been translated in English, a poetry written in Abu Ghraib prison. At your Christmas, Bagram is alit and bright. On my Eid, even the rays of sun are dead. Suddenly at midnight, your bombs bring the light. In our houses, even the oil lamps are turned off. So the complexity which Afghanistan has cannot be looked from one perspective. Who is a victor, who is a vanquished, get blurred very easily. This is a paradox, basically, of the US bombings and Taliban both engaging into bloody violence, which Hina has rightly pointed out somewhere, that it merges with that, where he mentions that the marriage has been bombed, with young girls have been killed. But on coming back to America and American soldiers who fought there, I had few experiences of interviewing them because one of my friend's husband was there as an American Marine in Afghanistan, and through him I got to talk to people who worked there, who served in Afghanistan, and when I asked them that you people have been totally involved in violating the human rights in Afghanistan, in engaging in a lot of unnecessary violence, then they were nonchalant. They said that we were just following orders. And we have nothing to do. We did what we are supposed to do in an enemy land. Maybe it's true. It takes me back to a documentary which I've seen long ago on the soldiers, US soldiers who came back from Vietnam, and they lost one of their ears because one of the ear has been chopped off to show humiliation to the superpower. And I can't recall the name of the documentary right now, but I can very well recall that one of a very young lieutenant, he said that when I landed in Vietnam, the colonel told me that shoot to kill. Then he asked the colonel that Aren't we here to kill a communist? How will we recognize that that person is a communist? Then the colonel said that you will recognize that person as a communist because he's dead. So that is, maybe you can recognize a Taliban because that person is dead. And you tell them that this is Taliban. This person who has been killed is Taliban. This vicious cycle of violence, the notion of aggressor and vanquisher, as I've been saying, gets blurred. Hina, through this letter, I feel somewhat reveals what another incident. I was planning to go to Kabul at one point of time, but I could not manage at that point of time because there was huge violence began, and because there was a lot of fighting going on between the government forces and Taliban. And when I met the Afghan ambassador in Delhi, and we were discussing about Kabul, I asked him that, why don't you provide me a visa? He said that I can provide you with a visa, but just for 10 days, and you cannot go out of Kabul. But I said, I have many friends in Helmand and Herat, and I would like to meet them. He said, it's not possible, Mr. Ghosh, because... And then I asked him that, why? When you think I'll be get killed or I'll be abducted? So he came up with something which I feel Hina has tried to portray. Ambassador said, no one wants to kill a foreigner in Afghanistan. It is just a wrong people at the wrong place. So this is probably, I think, which you have tried to portray, or Hina has tried to portray, that it is always the wrong people in the wrong place that makes the problem. And we need to see Afghanistan from the perspective of humanism, rather than which we have been saying from the perspective of interest, from the perspective of great gain, from the perspective of politics and only politics. Before I move into, I would like to ask the Debaroti you something that you talk about Tagore's humanism, right? And Tagore talk about the spiritual self and the physical self and spiritual self. And that part which is still haunting me in that letter is when the Taleb boy meets Kumkum and gets treated. How and he's eventually been perceived as evil, right? And how do you see from the perspective of Tagore this episode? Can you elucidate on that?
Thank you, Shoresh, for adding so many perspectives, because you have been to Kabul, you have witnessed all the complexities that are there, that exist there. So of course you did offer an enriching perspective. Yes, I have always been, very. I always had an unease about how to understand Tagore's philosophy, particularly from that essay which he writes on nationalism, because it is also in many ways very abstract. In fact, many of Tagore's works are, they rely heavily on symbolism and they are abstract. While I did understand that there is a deep-seated political ideology in his discussion, where he constantly talks about spirituality, where he constantly talks about finding the basis for unity. And he's talking in the context of India in that particular essay, where he looks at the social fabric rather than only understanding what you just mentioned, actually, rather than only understanding the problems as political, as external. He does make that very, very important discussion, I think, where he says that the problems are internal. And one needs to really look at diversity. One needs to look at so many layers of complexities that exist within the social fabric. I think, in that entire discussion, in that entire essay, this has been a very, very poignant political insight that Tagore has been constantly talking about through spirituality, through citing Kabir and Tukaram and Tulsidas. I think when I was reading Hina's letter, it is that one moment towards the end in which, and I think it kind of culminates in a moment of dilemma where, Kumkum is torn between her ethics as a medical practitioner to treat this young boy or to report him, because visibly, evidently, he was this very 14-year-old Taliban, or 14, 15-year-old Taliban boy. And I think it is that one moment of illumination, I would rather say, in which, again, it's that human to human connect that takes over the reins, rather than what is going on between two opposing fundamentalist ideologies, between statist forces, between what she feels as her ethical duty as a medical practitioner, even over and above that. I think it is that one moment of human contact where where this ideology of inclusion, of reaching out, of faith, of keeping faith in the other human presence becomes important. Whether that would culminate into a larger political ideology is a separate discussion altogether. But I think the parameters and the lenses through which we probably look at these human connections are very different from the political lenses. Like, it's akin to what even Shourish you mentioned just now. So that is where I think, that's probably one moment where I found Tagore's philosophy, his abstraction, and when he talks about spirituality, I think that is one moment where it becomes very concrete in the sense that, there is a translation from abstraction to concretization of that philosophy in that human can connect. Avirupa, would you want to add? Do you want to add something to it?
Yeah, please, Avirupa. Please.
No, I believe it's kind of complete. I don't know if it kind of brings to my mind the last scene of Rakto Korobi, where basically Raja says that, তুমি ভেঙে ফেলো আমার নিশান, আমি আমার হাতের মধ্যে তোমার হাত এসে ওকে মারুক মারুক মারুক. So basically talks about a confluence of forces that challenge the dominant negative facade. The moment of surrender.
And since you did mention Guantanamo Bay, Shourish, a lot of this particular presentation, we could not show you that clip today, but one of the texts that did appear in our discussion, and then it was part of this dramatization, were the poems from Guantanamo Bay, from Black Prison, and what was written by these Afghan prisoners.
Yeah, very well said. But you should go on with this presentation once more, and we should see this drama, because it's time now that it's in limelight once again, Debaroti and Avirupa. We should see it staged. So I would like to add another very important part before I move on. That it talks about Dasht al-Ala, right? The Mount of the Graves. But there is a story behind it, which I came to light because of a person whom I have met, and I'm sure that you know what happened there, because I am not elaborating, because the Taliban's prisoners have been taken from inside a compartment, suffocated to death, and the person who was in charge, whose military was in charge of taking those Taliban soldiers to somewhere, was Abdul Rashid Dostam. Dostam was one of the warlords. He's one of the warlords of Mazar-e-Sharif. Okay, so I have an opportunity of meeting Uzbek. He's an Uzbek, so very anti-Taliban all the time. So meeting a person who has been close to Dostam. So he told me something which I did not believe at first, but later one of the journalists who wrote about Dostam, he also mentioned that story. There's a story of love and hate behind this, because of the fact Dostam lost his wife due to Taliban aggression in Mazar-e-Sharif. His wife was a teacher and played a very significant role in Dostam's life. And he got killed in Taliban aggression, while Dostam has to flee for some part of time. And he again came back when America entered in 9/11. So he fled to Turkey and some in Uzbekistan and Turkey, Central Asia. So he came back, and after that, he told me that Dostam was in trauma after seeing the body of his wife, and through that he wanted to avenge his wife's death all the time, and he has killed Taliban, and as probably this is a story of vengeance, which led to this Dastelela incident. Of course, Dostam denied that he has done that, but nothing is ahistorical, and the world is so much filled with stories. So I decided to share this as I knew of this story. Before I move in, if is Obhijit Da and Shantonda, would you like to ask some questions? If you have any queries or questions.
Maybe if Obhijit Da wishes to respond now, and then you can carry on for a little bit and bring it to an end after that. Obhijit Da? অভিজিৎ দা কিছু বলবে?
Obhijit Da has just written, I think his head speaker is not, sound is not working, or the mic is not working.
Okay. Right. So I think that was a very interesting dialogue, because there was one perspective, I think, which Avirupa and Debaroti were presenting. And there was another perspective that Shourish was bringing in. Perhaps it's the different disciplinary approaches that were coming in. And together they were giving us a stereoscopic picture, perhaps one focusing on the political context more intensively, the other trying to perhaps focus on something beyond the political, something beyond what is apparently the political context. So together, I think both your perspectives really added to our understanding of not just the context of Afghanistan, but also of humanism, also of borders, also of the refugee crisis in the world today, in a larger ethical framework. So thank you very much for that. And maybe if there is one other direction, I think that Shourish wanted to take us in, maybe Shourish can do that. And after that, if Obhijit Da's mic starts working, maybe he can ask a question or give us his inputs, and then we can perhaps wind it up. Shourish, over to you.
Oh yeah, no, that is what I was trying to say. That and you and engage with Debaroti, and both Avirupa has come up with such a scintillating that I would like to. I had shared my experiences about it, and I firmly believe that if we constantly look into this refugee problem, which is occurring throughout the world, only through the understanding of politics, we might not be able to do that. We will fail them. We have been failing them since long, and we'll completely fail them. We need to look into the things with much more humanity, in a humanitarian perspective, which Tagore has probably come up with. And we need these plays, we need these literature to be staged to go to the people. I haven't read this letter before, and I thank both of you, both Debaroti and Avirupa. And Debaroti, of course, sent me that, and by reading that, I felt like I'm into it. I'm seeing something which is new, and I moved into this experience of which I have on Afghanistan, and the places where I have met the Afghan refugees, and how they are living in some unknown land, which and living a second-grade citizen's life there, even in Europe, in America, and somewhat just surviving out there. Obhijit Da, is your mic working now? You have been writing something?
Obhijit Da has put a comment in the chat box, I think, Shourish.
No, okay, I don't think.
He said no.
I would like to put in a small experience here. taking forward from our question of why we dramatized, uh, we there were different versions of this play, which in fact we incorporated what was affecting us, as you must have understood through our presentation, uh, and till the time we revisited it last into 2020. So in one of our presentations, which was held in Harrington Arts Center, this was a conference of international history syllabus reviewing across nations, and we staged it as
South Asian histories, I think. South Asian histories, yeah.
I suppose. And so representatives, history, teachers of history from Sri Lanka, Pakistan, Bangladesh were there. And at that time, the bombing of army school in Pakistan was fresh. And we decided to use the photos of the children bombed, and who we decided to use rather graphic images, I would say. And the representative of Pakistan, she just walked out in the middle of our performance, right when we were showing that. And there was this poem which went with it. And she just walked out and said that, I'm sorry, I cannot take it. That's one. And the other is when we staged it in Gurgaon, in a school where incidentally the ambassador to Kabul was present, Indian ambassador to Kabul was present there physically. And after our performance, he was like almost in tears. And he gave a very moving response to our performance. So those two,
and also spoke about the situation in Afghanistan, and did respond to the to the intertextuality that we have been trying to foreground. But every time it has been a very, very difficult decision, and one of dilemma as to how much of media and objects do we use on stage, because there's also a violence that's there in in representing what appears in the media. So we have always also been troubled by this question, that are we also propagating that violence? So it has always been a very, very difficult decision. Each time many of the times we have avoided using media and objects. In some interpretations, we had to rely on some of them. But yeah.
I hope the discussion, I know the discussion can go on Afghanistan and refugees and for a long, long period of time. If you permit, Shantonda, shall I now conclude on this, or we can go on if you want?
Yes, you can conclude, and we can.
Okay. Before concluding, I would like to thank both of you once again for bringing this presentation here, which is so very relevant now. But as Debaroti has mentioned in his presentation, I would like to conclude with that word, that no more. Yes, no more. And we have this Kabuliana connection with Afghanistan for a long time, and the refugees I have met, many of them had read Kabuliwala, and they can relate to Kabuliwala with India, and in fact, Ashraf Ghani, when he came to power, he the first thing he said, that with India we can be friends because we have this age-old Kabuliwala connection with India. So Kabuliwala is what drives us basically, and I can still remember meeting many Kabuliwalas when I was young, when they used to come into our locality, and I came face to face with Afghanistan from there. When I asked my mother who they are. My mother used to tell me they're from Kabul and they're Kabuliwalas, and that was the first I get accustomed with what Afghanistan is. And when I started working there, it was much more concrete, much more open. But I go back to what Debaroti had said, that no more. Yes, we can only hope that for a new dawn in Afghanistan, a dawn of peace and stability, which the Afghans have been hankering for ages, but not getting there. To this new dawn, I think we can resonate Tagore. We can, rather than unlike Adorno, we'll not say that we cannot write poetries in this turbulent times. We'll say we can, of course, write poetries. And while concluding, I will read a poetry which is very close to my heart, a translation from Faiz Ahmed Faiz, Umeed-e-Sheher. So I'll read a few lines. My heart is torn. Hear the wounds of my heart. Listen to the hope of a new dawn. I'm stricken with grief. Listen to my being soaked with tears. Listen to the hope of a new dawn. My tongue is dry and unable to talk. Talk to my gaping wounds. Listen to the hope of a new dawn. My feet are tired. Listen to the sorrows of my journey. Listen to the hope of a new dawn. From the one who travels in the dark desert of tyranny, hear him speak of the beauty of dawn. Listen to the hope of a new dawn. With this Umeed-e-Sheher ki baat sunu, we conclude this conference, and I would like to thank the organizer, the School of Media, Communication and Culture, Shayantonda and Obhijitda, and of course the speakers. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Shourish, for such an evocative and yet such a critical, for bringing forth such a critical discussion. Thank you so much. Thank you, Shayantonda. Thank you, Obhijitda. Thank you, Avirupa.
Thank you, everyone. It was a most enriching and enlightening session for all of us, and I hope we shall be able to continue sessions like this and learn from you and other scholars like you on these issues. Thank you very much.